Thank you so much. So this session is focusing on women leaders in delivering the Paris Agreement. And as we've already heard this morning, women leaders were really instrumental in gaining that historic Paris Climate Agreement, but also now women leaders across politics, business, philanthropy, and indeed social movements are going to be critical in turning that agreement into reality. But as we also know from this morning, there's still a lack of access to leadership, to decision-making for women globally. And at C40, we certainly believe that it's going to be critical to address that, to empower and enable even greater leadership by women across the world to really make that Paris Agreement and turn it into a reality. So in this session, hopefully we're going to explore how to do that. And we're going to start with Mayor de Lille. The Mayor of Cape Town, a member of C40, a member of the board of the Global Covenant of Mayors, so very much one of the leaders that we're focusing on in this session. And perhaps, Mayor, if you could start by connecting the local and the global, if you could tell us a bit about why you've made climate change such a focus of your leadership in Cape Town and how you think that translates into leadership globally.
Thank you, and good morning to all my fellow mayors. Really, I think the signing of the Paris Agreement was the easy part. What falls after that is implementation, implementation, and implementation. And that is where mayors play a major role, because it's our duty to make sure that we reduce carbon emissions and that we deal with all the other climate change impacts, especially on our women, on our poorest citizens in our city. I will just share a few things with you this morning. After the Paris Agreement, I went back to my city and of course made sure that every single decision and every single department is overlaid with climate change considerations. You can't just plan the way you used to plan 30 years ago. You have to work into your decisions every day on a daily basis. How do you deal with the impact of climate change? As I'm speaking to you in my city, we're facing the worst drought in 100 years. Now, if Mr. Donald Trump does not believe climate change exists, we certainly experience it on a daily basis. I still have got 120 days left of water in my city, drinkable water. And you have to think on your feet and you have to mitigate climate change on a daily basis. So yes, what have we been doing? In 2015, the C40 awarded the city of Cape Town a prize for our water conservation strategy. And if we had not done that, it would have even been worse than what it is today. So we deliver on making sure that now you need the resources to deal with the infrastructure, not only new infrastructure, but how to maintain old infrastructure. And therefore, as the City of Cape Town, we've launched a green bond initiative whereby we'll be selling the green bonds to help us to fund all of these initiatives. The green bonds will be accompanied by certified projects. We're looking at finding money to replace all our water meters, to deal with water leaks, to buy more electricity buses, and all of those things need funding. And so, by using the opportunity created by climate change, we are now utilizing that to put that into, for instance, job creation projects. We've also started a green economy initiative where we provide incentives to companies who are, producing solar panels, photovoltaic panels, and all of that. So I'm very excited, but let me tell you, Mark, every time I come to a C40 meeting, and I will never miss one of them for two reasons. The one is like a therapy to me because it's a place where I can feel people understand what I say, what I mean. You know, you've got other mayors that face the same challenges. And so I want to say thank you to all the C40 mayors because we always learn from each other. And thank you for the opportunity to be here, Mayor Anne Hidalgo, and also the friend of the mayors around the world, Michael Bloomberg. I thank you.
Thank you. And I thank you, Mayor. I think what we heard there's an example of really comprehensive climate leadership, of ensuring that climate policy is imbued across everything that the city does. I'm going to move now to Anne-Claire Legendre. Apologies for the terrible British pronunciation of her French name, the Consul of France to New York. And it's been mentioned a few times already this morning that in looking back to that historic Paris Agreement, there were a large number of women who were completely pivotal in creating that agreement. Christiana Figueres, Ségolène Royal, Laurence Toubiana, Anne Hidalgo. A lot of them were French. Was there an accident, or is there something more behind it that women were really driving that successful conclusion of an agreement after so long?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for giving me this opportunity on reflecting on how those women were pivotal in delivering the Paris Agreement. I think we have indeed to reflect how this strong female leadership impacted and made a difference in building the way towards the Paris Agreement, and what are the lessons we can learn from this female leadership to accelerate the implementation of the agreement itself. I think we can lay down there's two aspects I think that are really important and that were pivotal in delivering the Paris Agreement, and they were brought about by those female leaders. The first one, I think that those female leaders embodied a change in method in terms of negotiation during the agreement and on the way towards the adoption of the agreements. If you look at their profile, I mean, Christina Figueres, she was the Secretary Executive of the new UN CFCC. Laurence Toubiana, she was our lead negotiator under the French presidency for the COP21, but she already participated in Copenhagen in 2009 and built on this experience to define a strategy for the negotiation. But you had also Anne Hidalgo, of course, bringing the efforts of local authority into the process, and Ségolène Royal, our current Minister for Environment, who took over the lead after Laurent Fabius in the chairmanship of the COP21. So they brought about a new method in negotiation, and that led the way towards the success. So what was this method about? This method was about three elements. So of course we had the traditional intergovernmental process, you know, with negotiation at expert level, lengthy negotiation, took months and months in the UN framework, and then in Paris in the COP21 framework. But they made this analysis by, you know, using their experience of Copenhagen to that we couldn't follow the same recipe, or that would lead to failure. Because if you remember, in Copenhagen, the heads of state and the heads of government were brought at the very end of the process, and experts didn't manage to bridge the gap and differences that emerged during the negotiation. And so they asked the heads of state and government to bridge the gap at the very last minute, and they were not able to do so, and that led to the failure of this episode. So we decided, and that was really the intuition of Laurence Toubiana and Christina Figueres with Laurent Fabius, to reverse the sequence and start with a strong political commitment from political leaders. And that's why we decided to bring them to Paris at the very beginning of the COP21 meeting, for them to give this very strong political signal that they wanted a success in Paris and that they wanted an ambitious agreement. So that was the first new element that they brought. The second new element they brought was the inclusiveness of the process, because they say we need ownership from the different actors. We need ownership from the civil society, NGOs, private sectors, companies who would be impacted by the decision made in Paris. And so that was the reason we held all those consultations around the world with different actors, and we brought them to Paris in Le Bourget. 8,000 of them were represented in the margin of the negotiation, and we held daily consultation with them. So I think female leaders were really key in bringing about this new method because of their different background and different experience. The second thing I think that they brought to the Paris Agreement was the need and the necessity to recognize the gender equality in the agreement. And you know that for the first time, the Paris Agreement enshrines the fact that gender equality is a principle that we need to follow in all the aspects of climate change. And this is not just about political correctness. This is about the efficiency of our action. As you know, women are the first victims of natural disaster, especially in developing countries. And they are potentially, because of being the first victims, a very powerful actor of change. And so that's what we want to see in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So the fact that we need to empower them, we need to give them the right resources, we need to provide for funding, access to land, and so on, needs to be defined in all the different instruments of implementation of the Paris Agreement. So on the two important issues, female leadership was key, and I'm very confident that in France we will continue and keep up with the fight. Ségolène Royal and Anne Hidalgo are also, of course, very much involved in this fight. And I can tell you that our future ambassador for climate will also be a woman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and certainly from a C40 perspective, we very much noticed that different style of negotiation, because the real openness, as you said, to engage non-state actors like cities, which I think made a real positive difference in the end. I want to move now to the question of climate finance, because we have with us a great friend of C40, Naoko Ishii, who's the Chief Executive and Chairperson of the Global Environment Facility, one of the most important funding organizations regarding climate change. And we know that climate finance is one of the most important levers of the Paris Agreement. But tell us, how important is it to consider gender equality and climate action together? And how do you do that through the vehicle of climate finance? How are you doing that at the Global Environment Facility?
Thank you so much, Mark. And first, let me say how excited I am to be here, surrounded by female mayors, city leaders, private sector, community organizers. It's really my honor, Jeff's honor, to be a part of this endeavor. My response to the Mark's big question is, in short, yes, it's yes that we take the gender equality into the consideration when we think about the non-climate-related finance. However, I just want to say it has been a big journey, and a lot of progress was made, but there is a lot needs to be done together. But when I say that it's actually not only GEF, we have been working together with other climate finance, such as Green Climate Fund, Climate Investment Fund, or CIF, Adaptation Fund. So we came together and create a bit of group that how we can work together to take into account the gender aspect into the climate funding. And what we found together is very interesting. A few years ago, climate finance or climate projects are considered to be a gender neutral, say the coal power plant, renewable energy, where that gender aspect will be coming in. However, when we push ourselves to do the gender analysis almost say that close to 100%, right now it's 80%. But when going through this gender analysis, it turned out to be when we think that the gender neutral was actually gender ignorant. We have missed so many opportunities for us to take into account the gender aspect so that we can make a big difference on the ground. The important thing is not only finding out this gender neutral to be gender ignorant, but how we can take into account this finding so that we can make a difference in the project design. That's what I think we have been working. Maybe give you just one quick example to give you the sense that what we have been talking about. For instance, we have been creating a lot of fund to advance the renewable energy on the ground, mostly off-grid funding. But when we create this renewable energy fund on the ground, say in Africa, actually this example is in Gambia, but we try to actually earmark the part of the funds going to women and youth entrepreneurs so that they have a fair share to be innovative and to be encouraged and to take part in this journey. So like that, we are able to make a lot of progress once we come to know our own gender unconscious bias, a kind of gender ignorance. And let's turn it to be the gender conscious and the gender, to take into the more proactive approach to this very important area so that the journey will continue, but it's really worthwhile working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Naoko. So we're going to move now to Jainey Bavishi, who's the Director of the Office of Recovery and Resilience here in New York City. And I guess, a question in two parts for you. We've all experienced some difficult weather in the last day or so, but New York, of course, has experienced some really problematic impacts of climate change with Hurricane Sandy in the rather near past. How has the reaction to Sandy influenced the design of New York's adaptation and resilience strategy as part of your real focus on a more inclusive climate action process? And perhaps if I can just add in the extra bit, because it's sort of the elephant in the room here, and I guess you're the person who has to answer it, but how do you plan in New York to sustain your real focus on climate change in the face of the change from the Trump administration seemingly away from leadership by America on climate change?
Thanks, Mark. And I want to start by saying what an honor to be a part of this panel of feminist climate leaders. So thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for Mayor Hidalgo and C40 for organizing this important event. So I have the distinct privilege and honor of leading the Office of Recovery and Resiliency in the New York City Mayor's Office, which, by the way, is a team that's made up of 60% women, and that includes engineers, planners, community organizers, policy experts, communication specialists. And I see many of those people here in the audience today. If you could just stand up, I think it's important to recognize this amazing team. So as you said, Mark, Hurricane Sandy was a really pivotal moment in New York City's climate agenda. 43 New Yorkers lost their lives, 6,500 patients were evacuated from hospitals and nursing homes, nearly 90,000 buildings were in the inundation zone, 1.1 million New York City children were unable to attend school for a week, close to 2 million people were without power, and New York City sustained about $19 billion in damages. My office is responsible for implementing the One NYC plan, which builds on previous plans and outlines a $20 billion program to strengthen coastal defenses, upgrade buildings, protect infrastructure and critical services, and ensure that homes, businesses, and communities are safer and more resilient. This plan it's important to mention that this plan recognizes that Sandy exposed and exacerbated vulnerabilities that already existed in New York City neighborhoods before the disaster, whether it was inadequate infrastructure, environmental hazards, lack of affordable housing, and the list could go on. So we're putting forward an inclusive climate agenda that focuses on three important things. First, it focuses on neighborhoods primarily. It places a strong emphasis on equity, and it places a strong priority on public engagement. Now, Mark, you mentioned the elephant in the room, and I actually, this is very personal for me because I just recently joined the New York City Mayor's office, having come from leading the climate resilience work in the Obama White House. And so, we've had the privilege, and not only New York City, but cities across the United States have had the privilege of having a close partnership with Washington, D.C. for the last 8 years, and clearly things are changing. But it's no surprise that New York City is not going to wait for a global accord or Washington, D.C. to take action on the threats that climate change presents. And I can assure you that New York City will continue its commitment to do our part to fulfill the commitments of the Paris Agreement by reducing emissions and preparing for the impacts of climate change that we cannot avoid. But with that said, it's also irresponsible of the federal government to not play the role that it needs to play, and instead to undermine the global progress that we've made on these important issues. And so, as we all do our part, I think cities have an incredibly important role to play, not only in the United States, but around the world. We must also hold our national governments accountable. And I just wanted to make sure that I stated that. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think we are all hoping and, of course, strongly believe that America will deliver its commitments under the Paris Agreement, but perhaps with the leadership of mayors and governors and business and citizens rather than the federal government. But moving on to Jonathan Mayer at the end of the platform here is the Vice President, CSR and Sustainability for L'Oreal USA. And as we heard earlier, we're very pleased that L'Oreal are announcing that they're going to be a partner with Women4Climate and with C40. But you launched a couple of years ago at L'Oreal your 2020 commitment, Sharing Beauty with All. It's a lovely title. Can you explain to us a little bit about what that commitment means, how it's going to help in delivering the Paris Agreement from the business sector, and I think from your perspective, from the USA in particular?
Very gladly. Just a word of explanation. Some of you may notice in the agenda, in fact, our Global Chief Sustainability Officer was supposed to join on the panel today, Alexandra Palt, and as you can imagine, because of the storms, it was a little challenging. She's found a way to get here, but it's just cutting it a little close for this panel, and she'll be joining us a little later this morning. And it's a shame. Alexandra really has been at the inception of our sustainability strategy at L'Oreal, and she's also a great woman leader within L'Oreal. I am not. But I'm very honored to be here. I'm very honored to be with my co-panelists. In response to your question, L'Oreal had launched a sustainability strategy, a comprehensive sustainability strategy in 2013. Essentially, we understood that we needed a strategy where we looked across every rung of our value chain. We looked at every way we were impacting the environment and what would it require for us to transition towards a low-carbon business model, a low-carbon and more inclusive. This strategy is called Sharing Beauty with All. It was launched in 2013. It's a global strategy. I coordinate that strategy here in the USA. And at the advent of COP21 and following COP21, Alexandra and our global team had really chosen to use that moment to contribute, to ensure that we as a business actor were contributing towards meeting the COP21, within the COP21 framework, to meet those targets. So we felt the need to really accelerate and to enhance those. And if Alexandra were here, I have no doubt that she would speak to you about what we're doing globally, especially around sourcing. What I would like to do is just to say a word. I think it's a good case study for the people in the room in terms of what we're doing here in the USA, which I can speak to working here in the USA. And I think it's a very good example of how a company like L'Oreal, we have strong commitments, very visible commitments, but then the way we work is we look at each individual country, we look at what is our specific footprint in that country, and then we try to adapt the best solutions. In the case of L'Oréal USA, we have an important manufacturing footprint. We have 4 manufacturing sites. We also have about 17 or so distribution centers. And as was mentioned earlier today by a number of people, depending on where those factories are, they have different energy consumption profile. And so what L'Oréal USA did, essentially, which we had started quite a few years ago, but which we accelerated very recently, is we said we have to find solutions for every one of those given sites, every one of those given facilities, in order to move towards more renewable energy and more energy efficient facilities. And so what we did last year, which was a really important achievement for us, was that our target globally has always been to try to achieve a 60% reduction in absolute terms of our carbon emissions from a 2005 baseline. And in the US, we said there are ways for us to meet and to exceed those if we can find solutions for some of our manufacturing plants. So what we in fact did is we created on-site solar generation, so solar panel projects in two of our largest facilities in the country. One of those facilities is in Kentucky, and for those of you who know this, and it was mentioned a lot about coal energy, the electricity in Kentucky is generated by coal. It had a very negative carbon emissions factor. And so working with local actors, working with government agencies, we were able to find a solution, including installing the largest solar installation in the state, 1.5 megawatts in Kentucky, in order to move towards 100% renewable electricity, which we will be achieving essentially in about 2 or 3 months. So this is an important point, and I want to be very clear about this. Our plant manager, this is the largest plant we have worldwide. The plant manager is a woman. Her name is Nicole Frey, and she has displayed extraordinary leadership on this issue, not just in terms of manufacturing excellence, but also in terms of environmental stewardship. So I think a number of you have mentioned the need, you've mentioned yourself, that let's not lose sight of the number of great engineers and people who work in our operational teams who are really allowing us to achieve and to accelerate our environmental commitments.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. I think here and there both about the importance of women leadership, but also business working with cities, which I know is something Mayor Hidalgo is very keen that we focus on more in C40, and I'm sure we will be doing in partnership with you in the future. We're running a little bit behind time, so I'm not going to be able to take a full panel round for a second question, but I feel we should give the last word in this session to our Mayor, to Mayor de Lille, and perhaps if I can just ask you one supplementary question then. The whole focus of this event is empowering women and girls to be the next generation of climate leaders. If there's just one thing that you think we need to focus on, or perhaps that you are going to focus on, what is it to achieve that? Or is there a microphone?
Yes, certainly the impacts of climate change are mostly felt, the severity of that by women, and especially poor women, vulnerable women living in informal settlements around our cities. And since urbanization is a worldwide phenomenon where by 2030 more than 70% of the world's population will live in cities, it makes our responsibilities as mayors even that more important, because we have to plan not only to manage urbanization, but to also manage climate change and mitigate the impact of climate change on poorer women in our society. And therefore it's important that the people that know best how to deal and how to respond to the severity of climate change are the people who are directly affected by it on a daily basis. It's the woman who must walk miles and miles to go find water to wash and to feed her family. It's the woman who must try and build a small food garden to survive. And with water scarcity and droughts around our continent and around the world, we need to begin to lead as especially female mayors. Like Mayor Hidalgo has said, we must lead by showing what can be done and what women can do under these difficult circumstances. So it's our role as women mayors to empower other women so that they can survive the impact of climate change. And I'm certainly making sure, just to give you a quick one example, is that in my city, I've got a problem with illegal dumping. You know, people will just dump things anywhere. And so I drive around my city and I find all of those illegal dumping sites. I clear them, I put a fence around it, lock it with a key, call a community meeting and say to the community, now you take charge of this piece of land. There's the water, there's the fertilizer, there's the seeds. You now do your own food gardens within your own area. And not only did it help with food security, but it also helped with greening of the urban spaces. Because most of our cities were built for cars, not for human beings. And so we have to find more spaces that they can also do some greening and make sure that women lead in those initiatives. Women are natural leaders. I sometimes say we don't always have to repeat it. We know why we are in charge. We don't need to say it all the time. And therefore, we just need to make sure that we as women mayors are leading the charge against climate change around the world to make sure that our sisters, our mothers, our grandmothers out there that are suffering right now, that we assist them to mitigate the climate change. Thank you.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfectly inspiring way to end this session. We've now got a chance for a short break for a coffee or a cup of tea if you're British. But first, let's give a big round of applause to our panel.